All right, so this lecture begins our exploration of muscles, muscle tissues, and muscle actions. First off, the study of muscles. Myo, anytime you see myo or sarco, let's actually write this down. M-Y-O, anything, or sarco, S-A-R-C-O, anything. Those both mean having to do with muscles. So myology is the study of muscles. Now, when we're talking about muscles, we've talked about muscle tissue before, and muscle tissue is made of muscle fibers and muscle cells, what are called myocytes, literally muscle cells. And those tissues are all contractile. They're cells that are involved in motility. They're cells that are involved in moving your body. That's what skeletal muscles mostly do. They're also involved in moving things around your body, which is what cardiac and smooth muscles typically do. Though it is important when we say muscles are cells, there's actually a difference between a muscle cell, a myocyte, and a muscle. Like when we talk about your bicep or your, quadricep or something like that. Those are actually two very different things. Like muscles, like your bicep, is actually an organ. And as we will see, it contains a lot more than just muscle cells inside of it. In general, the function of muscle tissue is to convert chemical energy into mechanical energy. The chemical energy comes in the form of, well, ultimately nutrients that you eat, which are then converted into ATP, and then that ATP is converted into mechanical energy through a process that we'll talk about. The functions of muscle tissue. Well, first off, moving the body. When you walk from point A to point B, that's your muscles mostly moving your skeleton around, and that allows your body to move around. So that seems pretty obvious. But also, muscles are hugely involved in not moving the body. If you're standing still, if you're just sitting there being stable, muscles are involved in that. When you stand up, it isn't like your muscles aren't working. You have muscles in your ankle that are pulling against each other with exactly the same or close to the same amount of force. And that locks a joint in position, the fact that it's being pulled equally on both sides. That's called a stabilization effect. So muscles are involved in not just moving your body, but also in causing your body to not move and maintain stable. Storing and moving things around your body, right? So your stomach is a muscle. It's going to churn the chyme, your partially digested food. There's muscles in your intestines, which move food through your small and large intestines and eventually out of your body. You have muscles like your heart that moves blood around your body. You have muscles in your gallbladder that can, allow your gallbladder to store bile and then can squeeze to squirt the bile out when the bile needs to come out. And last, generating heat. Your muscles, because they're not perfect, when they do work, when they move, they burn energy, and not all of that energy is converted to motion. Some of that energy is converted to heat. We are warm-blooded creatures. We generate our own body heat, and it is primarily the activity of our muscles that does this. We can see this when you get too cold, you shiver, you're basically causing your skeletal muscles to twitch, and That's not for the purpose of moving. The movement isn't the goal in shivering. It's that you're using your muscles more. That burns energy, generates heat. Muscle tissue has some unifying characteristics that you should know. First, we have excitability. Both nerve and muscle cells are excitable. This means that they respond to some sort of stimulus with an action. And in this case, muscle cells can respond to chemical signals. Some muscle cells respond to stretch, and they can respond to electrical changes. So you put the right neurotransmitter in, the muscle contracts. Some muscles actually automatically contract when they are stretched. Your smooth muscle in your intestines, this is a good example of this. Or in actually your esophagus is probably the best example of this. When it's stretched, because you just swallowed some food, you stuck some food down there, it stretches the muscle, that muscle then automatically contracts to push the food farther down. That muscle that's right below it then gets stretched and automatically contracts to push the food farther down. This action is called peristalsis, and it makes sure that the food keeps moving down to your stomach rather than just like getting stuck somewhere in your esophagus. All muscles are also conductive. Muscles and nerves are both conductive, which means that a local electric field change will trigger a wave of electrical excitation that travels along the muscle fiber or muscle cell in this case. And when we talk about this wave of excitation, what we're talking about is a change in the electromagnetic field. The polarization, which side of the membrane is positive and which side of the membrane is negative. All muscle cells are contractile, right? This is kind of the defining characteristic of muscles. Muscles contract. Some muscles contract better than others, but all muscle cells contract. Muscles are also extensible. So muscles are they don't just contract, they also stretch. That kind of makes sense, because if you contract a muscle, if it wasn't able to stretch back out, then it wouldn't be able to return to its zero position. But not only that, all muscles can actually be stretched beyond their zero position, their normal zero position, and when they are stretched, they will return to their normal length. That function is called elasticity, and it's the last property that is universal to all muscle cells. There are 3 types of muscles or muscle cellular things in the body: skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. We're going to focus on skeletal muscle for most of the lectures here. Most of what we learn about skeletal muscle will also be applicable to cardiac and smooth muscle. And at the end of the section on muscles, I'm going to talk about cardiac and smooth muscle and note where and how they are different. Skeletal muscle is most of what we think of when we think of muscles. You know, for most people, if I say, think of a muscle in the body, they're going to say the bicep or, your quads or your lats, or if they're really knowledgeable, they might say the sternocleidomastoid. But most people probably wouldn't say the stomach, right? Some people might say the heart. Still, most of the muscle in the body that you think of as being muscle is skeletal muscle. These muscles primarily move the skeleton around. Some of them move other things around than the skeleton. So for instance, a lot of the muscles of your face move the tissue of your face around so that you can make vocalizations and so that you can make facial expressions and things like that. There are a few skeletal muscles that are actually not connected to the skeleton at all. But by and large, these are muscles that are at least attached to the skeleton on one end. And most of them are going to exist to move the skeleton around. We describe these muscles as being voluntary, meaning we say that they are under conscious control. This is really kind of a misnomer. The division between what's conscious and what's unconscious is not entirely a clear distinction. So for instance, the diaphragm, which causes you to breathe, is a skeletal muscle. It's under conscious control. But it doesn't stop when you go to sleep. Like if you pass out and you become unconscious, it keeps running. It has to be stimulated by your brain. If you sever the connection between your brain and your diaphragm, then the diaphragm won't work. It doesn't move on its own. But that doesn't mean it's always under conscious control exactly, and you can't control every skeletal muscle perfectly with your conscious mind. Like you can hold your breath, but you can't hold your breath forever. You can't actually hold your breath until you die. There are a few people that have trained themselves and can probably hold their breath until they pass out. But for the most part, like when you hold your breath, the signal to breathe gets stronger and stronger and stronger in your brain until reflexes take over and just force you to breathe, no matter how much you are willing yourself to hold your breath. So when we say it's under conscious control, what we really mean is that it's under direct control of the brain and can at least sometimes be directed by the conscious mind. When we think of a muscle, like when you think of your bicep, or when you think of your, lats, what you're thinking of is not just muscle tissue, right? It's muscle tissue with connective tissue binding it together, with epithelial tissue that forms blood vessels that are going to carry blood and nutrient supply to the muscle, and it's got neuronal axonal endings that are going to be stimulating and controlling the muscle. All of this is bundled together into what we think of as being a muscle. So it's not actually just muscle tissue, it is an organ. And it's a complex organ. It contains all 4 tissue types. Different compartments of the muscle are separated by stuff called fascia. Fascia is a sheet of dense, irregular connective tissue that binds together groups of associated muscles. And along with them, the blood vessels and nerves that feed them. So you've got muscle tissue, you've got connective tissue, the fascia, you've got epithelial tissue in the blood vessels, and you've got nervous tissue in the nerves. This fascia that surrounds a muscle or muscle group is usually contiguous with the dense, regular connective tissue that forms the tendons, right? So remember, you have your periosteum, right? So let's say you've got like a bone here. And remember that the bone is surrounded by the periosteum, which is dense, irregular connective tissue. And at the tendon attachment point, all of that dense, irregular connective tissue is going to bind together and start facing the same direction, making dense, regular connective tissue, and that is going to be the tendon. And once you get to the muscle, that dense, regular connective tissue of the tendon actually starts branching out and forms this dense, irregular connective tissue sheath that surrounds your muscle. And that is the fascia and what's called the epimysium or epimysium, right? Which are the connective tissue that surrounds a muscle. So you've got connective tissue that is, well, connecting things together. It's dense irregular that binds into dense regular of the tendon and then goes back into dense irregular surrounding the muscle, and it holds everything together, and it's all contiguous. So when you talk about a muscle, so say here we've got a muscle, and you see that this muscle is connected by a tendon to the bone. So as we were just talking about, the periosteum surrounding the bone comes together to form the tissue of the tendon, and then that tissue of the tendon branches out to form the dense, irregular connective tissue surrounding the muscle. There are actually 3 layers of connective tissue surrounding the muscle. The muscle is actually a bundle of bundles of bundles, right? And the biggest bundle is the muscle itself, and the muscle itself is surrounded by the epimysium or epimysium, and it is dense, irregular connective tissue that surrounds the entire muscle. All right? So this is dense, irregular connective tissue surrounding the entire muscle, and it's contiguous with the tendon, which is then contiguous with the periosteum. So it's going to bind the whole muscle together and connect it to the bone. That's the epimysium. But as you see this muscle here, right, that's the whole muscle there, and then you look inside and you see these bundles inside of it. Like, we've got a bundle kind of here. We got a bundle here. These are not cells. These are bundles of cells called fascicles. Each fascicle contains about 10 to 100 muscle fibers. A fiber, in this case, is basically a cell. It's going to be the smallest cellular unit of muscle tissue. These fascicles are surrounded by connective tissue called the Perimysium. So here you can see this is one fascicle that's been extended out, and then this area here, that is a blow-up of the fascicle. So note that inside the muscle, like in between the fascicles, right here and here, you have bundles of artery, vein, and nerve, usually together, in between the fascicles. And those are going to supply nutrients and blood and electrical impulses to the fascicles and the muscle fibers. The Perimysium, or Perimysium, which covers one fascicle, is also made of dense irregular connective tissue. So each of these fascicles is itself surrounded by dense, irregular connective tissue. And then you take a look inside the fascicle, and you can see that there are bundles inside of the fascicle. All right. This here. This here. This here. This here. Each of those looks like a bundle, and each of them is a bundle, but each of them is also a muscle fiber. As we will see, muscle fibers contain bundles of what are called myofibrils, which are the contractile proteins. So this here, that is one skeletal muscle fiber. That is, this thing here, is the equivalent of a muscle cell. And so the fascicle binds together a whole bunch of muscle cells, and it also has small blood vessels, capillaries, basically. Capillaries, venules, arterioles, and nerve axons contained within it. This single muscle fiber is also surrounded by connective tissue. It has its own layer called the endomysium. The endomysium surrounds a single muscle fiber, and it's primarily made of reticular fibers. So it's not dense, irregular connective tissue. It's a very, very thin layer of primarily reticular fibers that surrounds a single muscle fiber. Remember, a muscle fiber is the skeletal muscle equivalent of a cell. Now, if we take a look at a fascicle, so remember, a fascicle is a bundle of muscle fibers, and the fascicle is surrounded by the perimysium, which is dense, irregular connective tissue. There are things inside of it other than the muscle fibers. Certainly most of the area inside of it is the muscle fibers, and here you can see the muscle fiber, muscle fiber, muscle fiber. The muscle fibers are going to be coated with the endomysium, which is that reticular fiber-based coating. You will also find, so most of these muscle fibers have their nuclei stuck off to the side. They may or may not have mitochondria abundantly inside of them. Some of them actually don't have very much mitochondria at all. And the muscle fiber itself is a bundle of myofibrils, which are not cells, but they are the bundles of contractile proteins that act as the contraction unit. You will also find what are called satellite cells within the fascicle as well. And satellite cells are basically there to clean up and care for the cells of the muscles. The muscle cells, the muscle fibers, the muscle tissue. All of you, whether you know it or not, are familiar with the organization of fascicles within muscles, right? So you probably don't get a chance to look at human muscles on a pretty regular basis, but many of you probably do look at the muscles of other animals. You may be familiar with different cuts of meat, and that they can look very different. So like here we see this is a flank steak. This is a cut of chuck steak. Generally speaking, in a muscle, all of the muscle fibers will be running parallel-ish to each other. and they run in a grain. Flank steak is cut longitudinally. So each of these, what we think of as like grains going down, each of those is a fascicle. And here you can see the flank steak is cut along the length of the fascicles. Chuck steak, on the other hand, is cross-sectioned. And so we can see, so actually with chuck steak, what you're cutting through is usually a muscle bundle. So there are several muscles in it. But if you look in here and you see, all right, so I can tell that that is a bundle right there. Here I see that's a bundle there. That's a bundle there. That's a bundle there. And you can see that there are these places where you appear to have cut through the grain of something. Each of those is a fascicle. So when you're looking at a piece of cut steak, what you're actually looking at is a cut through the fascicles, and you can see the organization of the muscle. Muscles have a high demand for oxygen, for energy, and nutrients, right? That makes sense. They do a lot of movement. They have a lot of electrical activity. All of those take energy. So muscle tissue is highly permeated with blood vessels, both arteries taking blood in and veins draining blood away. A typical muscle, like a muscle that would be surrounded by an epimysium and would contain a whole bunch of fascicles, a typical muscle is penetrated by a nerve, an artery, and 1 to 2 veins. Once inside the muscle, those usually branch off. So your nerve, once it enters the muscle, may branch into a whole bunch of little smaller nerves, nervules. The artery might branch into arterioles. The vein might branch into venules, which are small branches of the same thing. And specifically the arterioles and the venules are going to branch into an abundant, like a large number of capillaries. Those capillaries will permeate the muscle tissue, permeate the fascicles, and run close by to all of the muscle fibers, bringing oxygen and nutrients and carrying away waste products, which are abundantly generated by muscle cells, and CO2. Remember, CO2 is a byproduct of metabolism. The more oxygen you use, the more CO2 you generate. So here we can see the structure of a muscle fiber. Now remember, a muscle fiber, as far as skeletal muscle is concerned, this is a muscle cell. It's really long. It's as long as the muscle is. And it's multinucleated, so it's actually kind of a bunch of muscle cells together. But they are all together. So there's one contiguous cytoplasm in this. And muscle fiber is usually organized with, in the middle, you have these long bundles of what are called myofibrils. All right, so this is a myofibril. A myofibril is a bundle of contractile proteins. Each of those contractile proteins is a microfilament, just like the microfilaments that we talked about with the cytoskeleton, right? So we have microfilaments wrapped into bundles. Those bundles are called myofibrils. The muscular fiber, the muscle fiber, contains a whole bunch of these myofibrils packed together, usually towards the middle of the cell. These myofibrils contain highly organized, like microfilaments and motor proteins, and the organization of them is what makes them all line up, which is what creates the striated or stripy appearance. We'll talk more about that later on. The muscle fiber is surrounded by the endomysium, which is primarily connective tissue, primarily reticular fibers. And the cell membrane of the muscle fiber has a special name. It's called the sarcolemma. Remember I said sarco means muscle, just like myo means muscle. One's Latin, the other's Greek, I think. I'm not sure which. But the cell membrane, which you can see here a little bit in blue, all right? The cell membrane that surrounds the muscle fiber is called the sarcolemma, and the cytoplasm inside of the muscle fiber also has a special name. It's called the sarcoplasm. So the sarcoplasm is just the cytoplasm of a muscle fiber. By the way, each of these units of the myofibril that contain basically one striation is called a sarcomere. So that's a sarcomere, that's a sarcomere, this here is a sarcomere, this here is a sarcomere. Typically, the nuclei, and if present, the mitochondria, will be pushed off to the side so that these long myofibrils are not interrupted. And going outside of the endomysium, you will have blood vessels, capillaries, basically, carrying oxygen and nutrients to the fiber, and you will have nerve axon termini. These are the endings of nerves, and they are going to be ending at things called neuromuscular junctions, and these are places where the muscle fiber can be stimulated chemically or electrically to contract. So we'll talk in greater detail about exactly the anatomy of a muscle fiber in the next lecture, but the summary for what you want to take away from this lecture is that you should know the characteristics of skeletal muscle, and specifically you should know the universal characteristics of all muscle. They're excitable, they're contractile, they're conductive, yada, yada, yada. You should know the functions of muscle tissue, moving the skeleton, generating heat, that sort of thing. And you should understand the organization of a muscle, that you have not just muscle tissue, that the muscle is surrounded by the epimysium, and that's connective tissue, and then inside the epimysium you have fascicles that are surrounded by a perimysium, and then inside each of the fascicles you have individual muscle fibers that are surrounded by an endomysium, and how each of these structures is permeated with blood vessels and nerves.